His hands were the first thing people noticed. Not always in a negative way. Sometimes just noticed. The way you noticed things that were different from what you expected. The way you noticed a scar on someone's face or a limp in someone's gait. Not with judgment, but with the involuntary registration of something that told a story you didn't yet have the context for. His hands were large, the knuckles enlarged from old breaks that had healed imperfectly, the skin on the right one mapped with scar tissue from the base of his thumb across the back of it to somewhere past his wrist in a pattern that looked like something had burned or torn and that the body had done what it could to put back together. His left hand was mostly fine, except for the two fingers that didn't quite straighten anymore, which gave that hand a permanent slight curl that was visible when he wasn't paying attention to it. He was, most of the time, not paying attention to it. His name was Daniel Reyes. He was 38 years old, former Navy SEAL, single father to one 9-year-old daughter named Elena, and he had been, for the past 11 months, an operations coordinator at Calloway Capital in Washington, D.C., a private equity firm that managed $11 billion in assets and that existed in a world where hands were noticed primarily in terms of what watches they wore, rather than what stories they carried. He had taken the position at Calloway because Elena's school was in D.C., because the school was good and Elena was settled in it, and the settling had cost them both something after the years of movement, and because the salary was sufficient and the work was within his capability, and the schedule had enough predictability that he could organize himself around a 9-year-old's life with reasonable consistency. He had not taken it because it was where he wanted to be. He had taken it because it was where he needed to be, which was a distinction he had made without drama and had not reconsidered. He was good at the work. Not in the way that required the world to know he was good at it, but in the way that produced results. Organized, precise, thorough, with a specific quality of attention to operational detail that his manager, a man named Grant who had been at Calloway for 7 years, had told him in his 6-month review was honestly unusual for someone coming outside finance. Daniel thanked him, and not explained what had produced the quality of attention, because explaining would have required more words than the explanation was worth, and would have redirected the conversation toward territory he didn't find useful. He came in early. He left on time because Elena's school pickup had a window, and being in it was non-negotiable. He did the work between those two events with the specific focused efficiency of someone who had learned, over years of operating in environments where inefficiency had consequences of a different category than missing a quarterly target, to make the available time count. He did not talk much. This was not unfriendliness. He was, with the people he worked closely with, warm in the direct and uncomplicated way of someone who meant what they said and said what they meant, and didn't fill silences with noise. But he didn't perform sociability, didn't join the conversations that happen in the office kitchen about things that seemed to require a lot of words for the amount of content they contained, didn't attend the after-hours drinks events with the frequency that seemed to be expected. He had been noticed for his quietness more than he had been noticed for his work, which was a thing he understood and didn't spend energy on. What he spent energy on was Elena and the work, and the morning runs he took before she was awake that were the thing that kept him functional, and the reading he did at night after she was asleep that was the thing that kept him sane, and the very occasional phone calls with the 3 men from his unit who he still talked to, who were the people in his life who required the least explanation of anything. This was his life. It was not a large life in the way that lives were sometimes measured, not by surface area or noise or the number of people moving through it. It was a concentrated life, a life that went deep rather than wide, that had chosen quality of presence over quantity of it, that had organized itself around the 2 or 3 things that actually mattered and let the rest go. He was, in this life, genuinely okay, not happy in the performed way, not content in the resigned way, but genuinely okay in the specific way of someone who had looked at what they had and decided it was enough, and meant it. Until the Thursday morning in February, when Margaret Calloway walked into the conference room on the 14th floor and said what she said about his hands. Her name was Margaret Calloway. She was 53, the founder and CEO of Calloway Capital, the woman whose name was on the building and on the flagship fund and on the framed profiles in the reception area that Grant had pointed out to Daniel on his first day with the specific reverence of someone indicating a monument. She had founded the firm at 31 with $12 billion and 2 clients and built it over 22 years into what it currently was, which was a significant thing to have built, and which she knew. Daniel had encountered her 3 times in 11 months. Once in the elevator, briefly, where she had looked at him with the assessing gaze of someone who saw everyone in her building as a variable in a system she managed. Once at a company all-hands meeting where she had presented the annual performance and he was one of 140 people in a hotel room. Once at a client event that Grant had asked him to staff, where his role was logistical and their interaction was exactly 0 words. He did not know her. He knew of her in the way you knew of people who occupied positions that gave their presence weight in all the rooms of the building that bore their name. The Thursday morning meeting on the 14th floor was a quarterly operations review, a meeting that Daniel attended because the operations coordinator role included it, that he had been attending for 3 quarters, that proceeded along predictable lines, and that he contributed to when he had something to contribute and didn't when he didn't, which is the correct approach to meetings, and the one he took. Margaret Calloway was in this meeting, which was unusual. She attended these meetings perhaps twice a year, Grant had told him, when something in the operations picture required her direct attention. Her presence had been mentioned in the pre-meeting email and had produced in the 14 people who filed into the conference room that morning the specific calibration of behavior that the presence of a founder CEO produced. The slightly more careful posture, the slightly more considered word choice, the ambient awareness of being observed by someone whose opinion of what they saw would matter. Daniel sat in his usual seat. He had a coffee and a notebook and a folder with the materials for his portion of the agenda, which was a process efficiency analysis he had been working on for 6 weeks and that had identified a set of workflow redundancies in the fund administration cycle that, if addressed, would reduce the administrative overhead of each fund close by approximately 23%. The meeting proceeded. Other people presented other things. Margaret Calloway sat at the head of the table and listened with the focused economy of someone who was distilling what was said to its essential components and filing what was essential and discarding what wasn't. Daniel's portion came at 40 minutes in. He presented the analysis, not lengthily. He had learned from operating in environments where concision was not just preferable but required to say the thing without the scaffolding around it. He put the key finding on the screen. He walked through the supporting data. He described the proposed changes. He noted the implementation timeline and the resource requirements. It was, in his own assessment, good work. Not showy, he didn't do showy, but solid, thorough, well-grounded in the actual operational data, with proposals that followed from the analysis rather than preceding it. When he finished, there was a brief silence of the kind that followed a presentation that had landed well, the silence of people processing rather than the silence of people deciding how to respond politely. Margaret Calloway was looking at the screen. Then she looked at him. Her gaze moved briefly, without apparent self-consciousness, to his hands, which were resting on the table in front of his folder, and she said, "What happened to your hands?" The room went still in a specific way. Not the processing silence, a different silence. The silence of people who were suddenly very aware of being in a room where something unexpected had happened, and who were running the social calculation of what it meant and how to respond to it. Daniel looked at her. He had heard this question before. Not often. Most people registered the hands and managed their curiosity without voicing it, because most people understood that the management of visible curiosity about another person's body was a basic social competency. But it had been asked before, in various forms, with various tones, and he had developed a range of responses calibrated to the context and the tone. He said, "Old injuries." 2 words, even, without the frost of defensiveness or the softness of someone who found the subject painful to discuss. Just the answer, in the register of a statement that was complete and that he was not going to expand. "From what?" she said. The room was very still. Daniel looked at her for a moment with the look that the people who knew him recognized as the look that comes before his version of patience, which is the patience of someone who was deciding how to proceed rather than someone who was affected. He said, "From a long time ago." Same register, same completeness. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who had received an answer that was technically an answer and was deciding whether to press it. She moved on to the next item on the agenda. The meeting continued. Daniel contributed once more on a separate matter with the specific precision and economy he always brought. He filed his materials when the meeting ended. He took his coffee cup to the kitchen. He went back to his desk. Grant came to his desk at 3:35. Grant was 42, a decent person, the kind of manager who was neither exceptional nor inadequate, and who had developed over 11 months of managing Daniel a specific respect for him that was partly professional and partly the respect that people sometimes develop for people who were manifestly more interesting than the context in which they encountered them. Grant stood at the edge of Daniel's desk with the look of someone who had something to say that he wasn't sure how to say. "She shouldn't have asked that in the meeting," Grant said. "It's okay," Daniel said. "It's not really," Grant said. "It was, Grant, it's okay." Grant looked at him. He nodded. He went back to his desk. Daniel went back to his work. What happened next was not something Daniel planned or sought or did anything to produce. What happened was that Margaret Calloway, returning to her office on the 14th floor after the meeting, said something to her assistant about needing the personnel files for the operations team updated to her office system, which was a periodic administrative request she made when she was doing a leadership review, and her assistant complied, and the personnel files went to her office system, and Margaret Calloway, at some point in the early afternoon, opened Daniel Reyes's file. The personnel files at Calloway Capital were standard in most ways: employment history, educational background, performance reviews, the administrative record of a person's professional life within the organization. What they also included for employees who had military service was the basic service record information that HR collected as part of the standard onboarding documentation. Daniel's basic service record information was brief because the portions of his service that were most relevant to the question of his hands were classified at a level that a private equity firm's HR department did not have access to and would never have occasion to seek. What the basic service record contained was United States Navy, 12 years, Special Warfare Operator, Honorable Discharge, Commendation Listing. The commendation listing was not classified. Margaret Calloway sat in her office on the 14th floor of the building that had her name on it and read Daniel Reyes's commendation listing. She read it once, then she read it again. The commendations were 6 in number. 5 of them were the kind that special operations personnel accumulated over careers of sustained performance in difficult environments. Commendations for mission excellence, for leadership under fire, for the specific and ongoing quality of conduct that the Navy honored with the language it had developed for honoring these things. The 6th was different. The 6th was a Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration the United States Navy could award. The citation that accompanied it described, in the controlled and specific language of official military documents, an operation in which Petty Officer First Class Daniel Reyes had entered a burning vessel in conditions that had been assessed by the mission commander as non-survivable, had made that entry 3 times, and had been directly responsible for the extraction of 23 personnel who would not have survived without the extractions. 23. The hands. Margaret Calloway sat in her office on the 14th floor of the building that had her name on it for a long time. Daniel was at his desk at 3:15, managing his departure timing because Elena's pickup window closed at 3:45 and the drive was 20 minutes, when his desk phone rang. Internal calls showed the extension. The extension was the 14th floor executive suite. He picked up. Her assistant said Ms. Calloway would like a few minutes if he had them before he left for the day. He said he had until 3:25. He took the elevator to 14. Her office was the corner office, which all significant offices in buildings like this were: the corner, the windows, the view that communicated the position. He had not been in it before. He sat in the chair across from her desk when she indicated it and looked at her with the expression he used for professional situations that he did not yet have the full context for: open, attentive, without assumption. She was, he noticed, sitting differently than she had sat in the meeting. The meeting posture was the posture of a person in authority in a room she ran, composed, forward, at the ready. This was the posture of a person who had been sitting with something for several hours, and now, slightly, its effect. She had the folder on her desk. He could see his name on the tab. "I looked at your file," she said.
She said it directly, without preamble, and without the performance of casualness that people sometimes used to cushion the things they were going to say next. He looked at the folder. He looked back at her. He waited. "The Navy Cross," she said. He was quiet. "The citation," she said. "I read it." He was quiet. She looked at him across the desk, not with the assessment of the meeting, with something different, something that required him to recalibrate what he was reading in her expression, because it was not an expression he had anticipated. "I want to apologize," she said. He said nothing. "This morning, in the meeting, the question about your hands, I want to be clear that I'm not apologizing because I read your file and now I know the answer. That's not the apology. The apology is for asking the question the way I asked it, in the room I asked it in front of the people I asked it in front of, when I didn't have the right to the information and the right way to ask wasn't in a conference room at a quarterly review." She held his gaze. "That was an intrusion," she said. "I don't typically intrude. I did this morning, and I want to acknowledge it." Daniel looked at her. He thought about what she had said. He thought about the distinction she had made, that the apology was not about the file, not about knowing now, not about the 23, just about the question and the room and the right. "Okay," he said. She looked at him. "That's it?" "You said what needed to be said," he said. "I don't need more than that." She sat with that for a moment. "I want to ask you something. And this time I'm asking it because I want to know, not because it came out of my mouth before I thought about it." "Okay," he said. "Why Calloway Capital? Of everything you could have done after 12 years, of everything your record says you were capable of, why operations coordinator at a private equity firm?" He looked at her. "My daughter," he said. "Tell me about her," she said. He thought about the question. He thought about the version of this answer that was the right amount of information for a professional context, and found that he wasn't inclined right now, in this office, to give the calibrated version.
"Her name is Elena," he said. "She's 9. She's been in D.C. for 2 years, and she's settled here in the way that kids settle when they've moved enough times that settled starts to feel like something worth protecting. Her school is good. Her teacher this year is the first teacher she's talked about at dinner consistently. She has 2 friends who she's had for almost a year, which is—" He paused, and something in his voice did the thing that voices did when they arrived at something true, which is longer than she's had friends before without the friendship being interrupted by a move. He looked at the window. The D.C. afternoon was doing its February thing, gray and specific, the kind of cold that was intentional. "So," he said, "Calloway Capital, because it's here and the schedule works and the salary is sufficient." Margaret looked at him. "She moves with you throughout your service." "She moved with her mother initially," he said, with the economy of someone who had said this enough times to have found its right shape. "Her mother died when Elena was 4. The deployment that followed, I requested assignment modifications that kept me closer to stateside. It wasn't always possible. She spent time with my sister in Phoenix during the periods I couldn't be there." He paused. "When I separated from the Navy 3 years ago, D.C. was where my sister's husband had a connection that produced the job offer, and Elena's school accepted her, and I said yes without looking very hard at anything else." "Because she needed to stop moving," Margaret said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "The fire," she said. "The citation. I want to—" She stopped. She started again, with the care of someone who was paying attention to the words they were choosing. "I want to understand what that was." He looked at her. No one had asked him to explain it in 4 years. The people who knew about it, his unit, his commanding officer, the people who had been at the ceremony, did not need him to explain it. The people in his civilian life did not know about it and did not ask. His daughter knew he had medals, in the vague way that children knew things about their parents' pasts that they hadn't fully assembled into context yet, and she had not yet asked the question that would require the full answer. Margaret Calloway was the first person in 4 years who had said, "I want to understand what that was." He thought about what to say and how to say it. "It was dark," he said. "The vessel had been burning for, we didn't know how long exactly when we got there,
long enough that the structural integrity was compromised, long enough that the assessment by the mission commander was that entering was non-survivable. He looked at his hands on the desk, the right one, the mapped scar tissue, the left one, the 2 fingers that didn't straighten. There were people in it. The radio contact had established there were people in it. The assessment said they couldn't be reached, and the assessment was based on accurate information, and the assessment was wrong in the specific way that assessments are sometimes wrong, which is that they were based on what was known, and what was known was not everything. He looked up. "I could hear them," he said, simply. "I could hear them, and I could see a path, and I took it." Margaret looked at him. 3 times, she said. 23 people, he said. It took 3 entries. She was quiet. "The hands," she said. "The 3rd entry. The fire was by the 3rd entry. The fire was past what it had been. The path I'd used the first 2 times wasn't the same path anymore." He looked at the right hand. It was fast. The hand was the price of fast. He said it the way he said things that were simply true, without drama, without the performance of stoicism that was its own kind of performance, just the plain accounting of what had happened and what it cost and what was on the other side of the cost. 8 people, he said, the 3rd entry. 8 people who were at the back of the space and who were still there because the first 2 entries had prioritized the closest and most critical. There were 8 people at the back of the space, and I knew the path was closing, and I went fast. The office was very quiet. "The hand," she said, again, quietly, not asking, just acknowledging. "It healed," he said, "not perfectly, well enough." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression that had replaced the usual authority of her expression, not diminished, not soft in any weak way, but different, the expression of someone who had looked at something directly and was sitting with what they saw. "Mr. Reyes," she said. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel," she said, "I want to say something that is not an apology and not a professional observation. I want to say it as one person to another person." He waited. "I've been running this firm for 22 years. I've sat across from a great number of people in this office. I've learned things from them, what they said and what they didn't say, and how they held themselves under pressure, and what they did when the situation gave them the option of the easy choice or the right one." She held his gaze. "The question I asked this morning was not who you were in this office. I want you to know that now and that I understood it honestly approximately 4 minutes after you left the conference room." He looked at her. "Then why did you read the file?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about the answer you gave me. Old injuries, 2 words, the complete answer, the closed answer, the answer that didn't invite anything further, and the way you said it." She paused. "I've been in rooms with a lot of people who had things they didn't want to discuss. Most of them conveyed that through discomfort or defensiveness or the performance of casualness that wasn't actually casual. You conveyed it through," she paused, looking for the word, "through absolute steadiness, like the question was fine and the answer was sufficient and there was nothing else required of the moment." She looked at the folder. "That kind of steadiness comes from somewhere. I wanted to know where it came." He said nothing. "I shouldn't have read the file to find out. That's a separate apology from this morning's. The question in the meeting was an intrusion. Reading the file was a different kind of one." "You're the founder," he said. "The files are yours to read." "Technically," she said. "Ethically, I went looking for something that wasn't mine to look for just because I could." She held his gaze. "I want to own that directly." He thought about the distinctions she was making, the meeting question separate from the file reading, the technical permission separate from the ethical claim, and the acknowledgement of each on its own terms. He thought about a person who had sat with something for several hours, then called him upstairs and said it clearly. "It's fine," he said, genuinely. She looked at him. "You mean that?" "I mean most things I say," he said. She sat back slightly. Something in her expression shifted, not relaxing exactly, but settling, the expression of someone who had been carrying something and has put it down. "Tell me about Elena," she said. He looked at her. "You told me about the school and the friends. Tell me about her." He thought about Elena, He thought about what to say to a woman who had read his Navy Cross citation, then called him upstairs and apologized twice for two separate things, and was now asking about his daughter in the way of someone who was actually asking. "She talks to plants," he said. Margaret looked at him. "She has 3 plants in her room. She names them. She tells them things. I asked her once what she tells them, and she said she tells them what kind of day she had because she read that plants respond to sound, and she wants to give them interesting sound." She paused. "She's 9. "She's remarkable," Margaret said. "She's also going to be late for pickup if I don't leave in 4 minutes." Margaret looked at the clock on her desk. "Go," she said. He stood. He picked up his folder. He looked at her across the desk. "The 23% reduction in administrative overhead from the operations review this morning. The proposal has merit that I think got lost in the meeting once—" he paused, finding the word, "once the atmosphere changed. I'd like to present it again when the conditions are cleaner." She looked at him. "Come back Thursday, same time. I'll be at the meeting with different ears." "Thank you," he said. He went to the door. "Daniel," she said. He turned. "The plants," she said. "Does it work, the talking to them?" He thought about Elena's 3 plants, named in sequence, watered on a schedule that Elena maintained with the same precision she brought to everything she decided to care about. He thought about the plants, which were, objectively, healthy. "They're thriving," he said. "She says it's because they know someone's paying attention." Margaret looked at him. "I believe that," she said quietly. He left. He drove to Elena's school in the February gray, 4 minutes under the wire. She came out of the building with her backpack and her lunchbox and the expression that told him how the day had been before she said a word, because he had been reading her expressions for 9 years, and he knew the lexicon of them. Today's expression was the good one, the slightly elevated version of her usual composure that meant something had happened that she wanted to tell him about. "Good day," he said. "Ms. Reyes said my science project was the best in the class. She said it to me specifically, not to the whole class, just to me afterwards." He drove. "What was the project?" "The effect of sound on plant growth. I did it on Marcus, Aurelius, and Tiberius." "The plants. How did they do?" "Marcus grew the most. He gets the most talking. I think there's a correlation." She said correlation the way she said most science words, with the precision of someone who used it correctly and knew she used it correctly and didn't make a thing of it. "Ms. Reyes said I should think about a science fair entry." "What do you think?" "I think Marcus, Aurelius, and Tiberius have given enough to the cause," she said seriously. "They deserve a quiet period." He laughed, the real kind. She looked at him. "How was your day?" He thought about the conference room, the question about his hands, the 2 words, the file, the 14th-floor office and the 2 separate apologies, and a woman who had said, "That kind of steadiness comes from somewhere." "Interesting," he said. Elena processed this. "Good interesting or complicated interesting?" "Both," he said. "Mostly good by the end." She nodded with the acceptance of a person who had learned that both and answers were usually the honest ones. "Okay."
She said, "Can we have pasta tonight?" He said, "We can have pasta." "With the shells," she said. "The shells are the best because the sauce gets inside." "The shells," he agreed. Thursday came. The 14th floor meeting was different from the quarterly review. Smaller, just Margaret and Grant and Daniel and 2 senior analysts. The atmosphere, Grant had mentioned, was, as promised, cleaner. Daniel presented the operations analysis in full. The questions were substantive. The discussion was productive. By the end of an hour, a pilot implementation had been approved for the first quarter. Margaret said little through the meeting itself. She listened with the total presence he had seen in the quarterly review, and that he understood now, with the additional context of 2 apologies and the plants, was simply her way of being present, full, without performance, the way that very few people were actually present in rooms. After the meeting, as the group filed out, she said, "A moment, Daniel." He stayed. Grant closed the door behind him. She looked at the table in front of her for a moment, then at him. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Elena and the school and the settledness and what it cost to get there." He waited. "We're opening a DC office annex in the fall, a new operational hub. The work you identified in the analysis is exactly the kind of structural gap the annex needs to address from the start rather than after the fact. I want to build the operations function there correctly, from the ground up, with the right leadership. She held his gaze. I'd like you to consider leading it. He looked at her. That's a significant step. Yes, she said. That's why I'm asking you. Why me specifically? I've been here 11 months. You've been here 11 months and you identified a systemic inefficiency that my 7-year operations team missed. You presented it without self-promotion and without political navigation, just the finding and the recommendation. You answered a question this morning with 27 fewer words than anyone in this firm would have used, and the answer was more complete. She paused. And you go home at exactly the same time for exactly the same reason, and you haven't once apologized for it or explained it or asked permission for it. You just do it, because it's what you're there to do. She looked at him steadily. I want people who do what they're there to do, at every level. He thought about the proposal. He thought about the annex and what it would mean, and whether the stability of Elena's school and her friends, and Miss Reyes and Marcus and Aurelius and Tiberius, and the quiet period they deserved, could absorb what a new role would require. The annex is in D.C., he said. Same building, different floor. He thought about it for a moment with the focused economy of someone who made decisions by assessing the actual variables rather than the anxiety around them. I'll have thoughts by Monday, he said. Good, she said. He stood. She remained seated. There was a moment, brief, acknowledged by both of them without words, in the way that certain moments were acknowledged, where the conversation had contained more than its professional content, and both parties were aware of this and had decided to let the professional content be the container rather than acknowledging the extra weight directly. Elena, she said as he reached the door. Marcus, Aurelius, and Tiberius. He turned. Tell her the correlation holds between attention and growth. In my experience, it holds across most living systems. He looked at her. I will, he said. He went home that evening with the scope document in his bag and Elena's school pickup at its usual time and the pasta shells with sauce inside for dinner that Elena had been counting on. And after dinner and homework and the plant watering and the negotiations about 9 o'clock and the lights out and the falling asleep and the quiet of the apartment that was his particular quiet, he sat at the kitchen table and read the scope document. He read it twice. He thought about a burning vessel and a closed path and the price of fast. He thought about 23 and a Navy Cross that lived in the back of his closet in a box he hadn't opened in 4 years. He thought about a woman who asked a bad question in a conference room and then sat with it for 3 hours and apologized twice for 2 separate things, and who had said that kind of steadiness comes from somewhere with the specific attention of someone who actually wanted to know. He thought about Elena talking to her plants because she wanted to give them interesting sound, and because she had read they responded to attention, and because she had done the experiment and the correlation held. He thought, attention and growth, most living systems. He thought, she's right about most things. He made a note on the scope document's margin, a small one, a structural observation about the operational integration pathway that had a solution he could see and that the document hadn't accounted for, the kind of note that said, I was here, I looked, I saw something. He would share it Monday. He closed the document. He went to bed. He slept well. If you have ever been in a room where someone reduced you to your surface and you said nothing because nothing needed to be said, this story is for you. The steadiness is not silence. The steadiness is knowing who you are so completely that the question of whether the room knows it is genuinely secondary. Some people carry what they carry without requiring the room's permission to carry it. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the right person reads the file and comes back and says 2 separate apologies for 2 separate things and asks about the plants. Drop a comment and tell us about someone who showed up quietly and turned out to be the most remarkable person in the room. We read every single one. Subscribe for more stories like this every week. We'll see you next time.